The air in the Warrington Estates old chapel smelled of burning wood and cold stone, a strange marriage of warmth and desolation that clung to me like a second skin. The auxiliary fireplace crackled behind the altar, its amber glow spilling across the white lace of my wedding dress. A dress I hadn't chosen, hadn't wanted. My hands trembled as I clutched the silver necklace Sophie had given me years ago, its delicate chain biting into my palm. It was the only thing tethering me to the life I'd known before this moment, before I became a bargaining chip in a game I didn't understand. I stood there, 34 years old, staring at James Warrington. Jim, as the world called him. His eyes were a piercing blue, sharp as ice over a frozen lake, cutting through the dim light of the chapel. He didn't smile. He didn't speak beyond the bare minimum required by the officiant, a gray-haired man who seemed as uncomfortable as I was. There were no flowers, no guests, no music. Just the two of us. A contract on the table, and the weight of a debt I couldn't pay any other way. Sophie. My little sister. 24, reckless, and drowning in gambling debts she'd racked up in some seedy casino downtown. I could still see her last night, sprawled on the couch in our cramped apartment, her shirt stained with cheap whiskey, her eyes glassy as I pulled a clean sweater over her head. "I'll fix it, Lily," she'd slurred. But we both knew she couldn't. The calls had started a week later, creditors with voices like gravel, threatening to break more than just her spirit if the money didn't come. Then Jim appeared, a shadow in a tailored suit, offering a deal. Marry him, and Sophie's slate would be wiped clean. "I'm doing this for her," I whispered to myself, the words a mantra against the panic clawing at my chest. But when I looked at Jim, standing there with his broad shoulders squared and his jaw set like a man who'd never known doubt, I felt nothing but ice. He wasn't a savior, he was a buyer, and I was the goods. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice a dry rasp. "Do you, Lillian Carver, take James Warrington to be your lawfully wedded husband?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear this dress off and run back to the life I'd had. A small life, yes, but mine. Instead, I forced the words out, each one a shard of glass in my throat. "I do." Jim's turn came next. "I do," he said, his voice low and steady, like a judge passing sentence. No hesitation, no warmth. Just a transaction completed. The officiant nodded, muttered something about rings, we didn't have any, and pronounced us man and wife. That was it. No kiss, no applause, just the scratch of a pen as Jim signed the contract and slid it toward me. I stared at it, my name already typed in neat black letters, waiting for my signature to seal the deal. My hand shook as I picked up the pen, the necklace digging deeper into my skin. I signed. Lillian Carver became Lillian Warrington, and Sophie's debt vanished with the stroke of ink. Jim finally spoke, his tone clipped and final. "You're my wife on paper. Don't expect anything more." I met his gaze, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I don't need you. I just need her safe." He didn't flinch, didn't soften. He just nodded, as if my defiance was part of the bargain he'd anticipated. "She will be. That's the deal." I turned away, unable to look at him any longer. The fireplace snapped behind me, a sudden burst of sparks lighting up the shadows on the stone walls. It felt like a mockery of warmth, a lie in this cold, hollow ceremony. I stepped toward the heavy wooden doors of the chapel, my heels clicking. Against the floor, each sound a reminder of the cage I'd just locked myself into. The necklace swung against my chest, a small, cold weight that grounded me. Sophie's gift, Sophie's lifeline. I'd sold my freedom for her, and I'd do it again if I had to. But as I reached the threshold, I couldn't help glancing back. Jim stood there, still as a statue, his hands in his pockets, watching me with those unreadable eyes. For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in them. Regret, maybe, or a shadow of something human. Then it was gone, swallowed by the icy mask he wore so well. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the night, the chill of the air biting at my bare arms. The estate sprawled before me, a labyrinth of wealth and power I didn't belong in. The fireplace's glow lingered at my back, its dance of light and shadow following me like a ghost. I told myself I'd keep my distance from Jim, that this marriage was just a means to an end. I'd protect Sophie, hold on to my pride, and survive this gilded prison on my terms. But deep down, beneath the anger and the fear, a quiet voice whispered, a question I couldn't answer. What kind of man buys a wife to save her sister? And what kind of woman says yes? I tightened my grip on the necklace, the metal warming against my skin, and walked into the darkness. The fire behind me burned on, a silent witness to the vow I'd made, not to Jim, but to the family I'd fight to keep whole. The penthouse smelled of money, sharp whiskey and polished leather, a scent that hit me the moment I stepped off the private elevator. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, framing the city below like a glittering trophy case, all neon lights and distant lives I'd never touch. I stood there, 34 and out of place, my worn sneakers silent on the marble floor. The silver necklace Sophie gave me hung heavy against my chest, a lifeline in this sterile world I'd been thrust into. James Warrington, Jim, didn't look up from his desk as I entered. He sat in a leather chair, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, a pen scratching across papers in the other. The man I'd married yesterday was a stranger in a suit worth more than my entire life, his broad shoulders cutting a sharp silhouette against the city glow. I hated him for it, for the ease with which he owned everything, including me. "Your room's down the hall," he said, his voice flat, not even glancing my way. "Second door on the left. Don't touch anything else." I clenched my fists, the necklace digging into my palm. "I'm not your maid, or your prisoner." He finally looked up, those ice blue eyes locking onto mine. "You're my wife. That's the deal. Wear this tomorrow." He slid a garment bag across the desk, a sleek black dress that screamed wealth and expectation. "There's a press event. Keep your mouth shut and look the part." I didn't move to take it. "I didn't sign up to play dress-up for you." "You signed up to save your sister," he shot back, his tone cutting like a blade. "This is part of it. Don't test me, Lillian." The way he said my name, cold, precise, made my skin crawl. I wanted to throw the dress in his face, storm out, and drag Sophie away from all this, but I couldn't. The memory of her last night in that dingy apartment, her shirt soaked with sweat and shame as I pulled it off her, kept me rooted. I'd promised her safety, and this was the price. Before I could snap back, the elevator hummed again. A man stepped out, taller than Jim, with the same sharp jaw but darker eyes, a predator's grin curling his lips. Edward Warrington, Jim's older brother. I'd seen his face in the tabloids, the charming heir to Warrington Corp., the family empire I now belonged to whether I liked it or not. "Well, well," Edward drawled, his gaze raking over me like I was a cheap trinket. "The new Mrs. Warrington. A little rough around the edges, aren't you? What did you dig her up from, Jim? A pawn shop?" My cheeks burned, but I held my ground. "Better than being a vulture circling for scraps." Edward laughed, a sound that grated against my nerves. "Feisty. I like that. Too bad you won't last long in this family." Jim stood, his chair scraping back. "She's my choice, Edward. Not your business. Get out." There was steel in his voice, a quiet command that made Edward's grin falter, for a heartbeat. But he recovered, shrugging as he sauntered toward the elevator. "Fine. Enjoy your charity case, little brother. We'll see how long she shines." The door slid shut, leaving a silence thick enough to choke on. Jim sat back down, picking up his pen like nothing had happened. I stared at him, my pulse racing. He'd defended me, barely, but it didn't feel like protection. It felt like possession. I grabbed the garment bag and turned to leave, my sneakers squeaking against the marble. But as I passed his desk, something caught my eye. A small, tarnished pocket watch tucked beneath a stack of papers. The initials J&S were scratched into the casing, faint but deliberate. My fingers twitched, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, brushing the dust off its face with my sleeve. It felt warm, alive, a relic from a man I didn't know. "What are you doing?" Jim's voice snapped me back, sharp and low. I pulled my hand away, the watch clattering softly against the desk. "Nothing. Just cleaning up your mess." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. "Go to your room." I didn't argue. I stormed down the hall, the garment bag slung over my shoulder, and found the second door on the left. The room was pristine. White linens, a king-sized bed, a view of the city that mocked me with its beauty. I dropped the bag on the floor and sank onto the mattress, my fingers tracing the necklace's chain. Sophie's laughter echoed in my mind, bright and unbroken, from a time before the debts and the despair. I'd wear his damn dress tomorrow, play his game, but I'd do it for her, not him. Standing, I crossed to the mirror on the wall. The woman staring back looked like a stranger, pale, tense, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. I unzipped the bag and pulled out the dress, its silk cool against my skin. I slipped it on, the fabric molding to me like a second skin, and tucked Sophie's necklace beneath the neckline. It pressed against my chest, a secret rebellion against the role I'd been forced into. The city lights blinked outside, indifferent to my war. I didn't belong here, in this penthouse or this marriage. Jim could dress me up, parade me around, but he'd never own me. I'd keep my distance, hold on to the scraps of myself I had left, and make sure Sophie came out of this hole. But as I turned away from the mirror, the watch flashed in my mind, those initials, that fleeting warmth. Who was S? And why? Did Jim, the man with everything, keep something so worn and broken close? I pushed the thought down, burying it beneath my resolve. It didn't matter. He didn't matter. Only Sophie did. The whiskey scent lingered in the air, a cold flame I couldn't escape. Tomorrow I'd face the world as Lillian Warrington. Tonight, I was still Lily Carver, and I'd fight to stay that way. The coffee shop smelled of toasted bread and burnt sugar, a warm hum that wrapped around me as I pushed through the door. It was a small place near Sophie's apartment, a refuge from the penthouse's cold glass and whiskey fumes. The golden light from the hanging bulbs spilled over the worn wooden tables, softening the edges of a world I barely recognized anymore. I clutched the silver necklace against my chest, its familiar weight steadying me as I scanned the room for her. Sophie sat in the corner, her dark hair tangled, her jacket slung over the chair like she'd just stumbled in from another bad night. She was 24, but the shadows under her eyes aged her beyond that. I crossed the room, my sneakers scuffing the floor, and slid into the seat across from her. Up close, I could see the stains on her shirt, sweat, maybe beer, and the faint tremble in her hands as she gripped a chipped mug. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice soft. "You okay?" She didn't look up. "Fine. You didn't have to come." I reached into my bag, pulling out a clean sweater I'd brought from her place. "You're a mess, Soph. Let me help." I stood, moving to her side, and tugged the stained shirt over her head like I'd done a dozen times before. She didn't fight me, just sat there, limp and quiet, as I slipped the sweater on. The fabric smelled of her old lavender detergent, a piece of the life we'd lost. "I don't need you babysitting me," she muttered, finally meeting my eyes. Hers were red-rimmed, defiant. And I don't need him fixing my mistakes. Him, James Warrington. My husband of 3 days, the man who'd bought my freedom to save her. I sat back down, my fingers tightening around the necklace. He's not fixing anything. I am. You think I wanted this? Sophie's laugh was bitter, cutting through the cafe's hum. You married a billionaire, Lily. Don't act like it's some big sacrifice. Her words stung, sharp as a slap. I leaned forward, my voice low and fierce. I married him so those thugs wouldn't break your legs. Or worse. Don't you dare make this small. She flinched, her bravado cracking, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she'd been, giggling over burnt cookies in our old kitchen, before Dad left and the debts piled up. But then her jaw tightened, and she pushed the mug away. I'll pay it back. I don't want his money. Or yours. You can't, I said, the truth heavy between us. Not yet. That's why I'm here. The door chimed behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know it was him. Jim's presence filled the room like a storm cloud, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He stopped beside our table, his shadow falling over Sophie's hunched form. Get up, he said, his voice cold and clipped. You're coming. With us. I shot to my feet, blocking his view of her. She's not your property. Leave her alone. His blue eyes met mine, unyielding. She's a liability. If she stays out here, the creditors will find her again. You want that? I hated that he was right. I hated the way his logic sliced through my anger, leaving me raw. She's my sister, I snapped. Not some problem for you to solve. Then act like it, he said, his tone dropping to a growl. Get her in the car or I will. Sophie stood, shoving her chair back with a screech. I'm not going anywhere with him, or you. I'd rather take my chances. Sophie, please, I said, grabbing her arm. Her skin was clammy, trembling, under my fingers. You don't have to like it, but you need to be safe. She yanked free, her voice rising. Safe? You sold yourself to him, Lily. Don't pretend this is for me. You just want to play the martyr. The words hit like a punch, stealing my breath. I opened my mouth to argue, but Jim stepped forward, his hand brushing my shoulder as he faced her. Enough, he said, his voice a quiet thunder. You're coming with us because I said so. End of story. Sophie glared at him, then at me. But something in his tone, or maybe the exhaustion in her bones, made her slump. She grabbed her jacket and stormed toward the door, leaving me staring at Jim. You don't get to order her around, I said, my voice shaking. She's not yours. She's yours, he replied, his gaze piercing through me. And you're mine. That's how this works. I wanted to scream that I wasn't his, that I'd never be, but the weight of Sophie's safety pressed down on me, silencing the fire in my throat. You don't know what family means, I said instead, my words a desperate jab. You don't get it. He didn't blink, but his voice softened, just for a second. I know it, and I walked away from it once. You haven't lost yours yet. The confession hung there, raw and unexpected, like a crack in his icy armor. Before I could respond, he turned and followed Sophie out. I stood frozen, the cafe's warmth fading around me. What did he mean? Who had he lost? The questions gnawed, at me, but I pushed them down, focusing on the one thing that mattered. Sophie. I grabbed her mug, still half full, and set it on the counter, my fingers brushing the warm ceramic. Her whisper echoed in my head. Don't suffer for me. But I already had. I stepped outside, the cold air biting my face, and saw Jim holding the car door open for Sophie. She climbed in, her defiance muted but not gone. His eyes met mine, across the lot, steady and unreadable. I walked toward them, the necklace swinging against my chest, a reminder of why I was here. I'd fight him every step, keep my walls up, but I wouldn't let Sophie fall. Not again. The car's engine purred to life, a cold flame driving us back into his world. I slid into the back seat beside her, my hand finding hers in the dark. Rain tapped against the penthouse windows like a restless heartbeat, a steady rhythm that matched the unease coiling in my chest. The living room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the fireplace, its flames flickering low and weary. The air smelled of damp wood and the faint musk of Jim's cologne, a scent that lingered even when he wasn't near. I stood by the hearth, 34 and restless, my fingers tracing the silver necklace Sophie had given me. It was my anchor, a piece of her I could hold on to in this gilded cage. James Warrington, Jim, sat across the room, his silhouette sharp against the city lights bleeding through the glass. He'd brought Sophie here after our fight at the coffee shop, locking her in a guest room upstairs with a promise to sort her out. I'd argued, pleaded, but his cold resolve had won. Now, the silence between us was a battlefield, and I was losing ground. I turned to the fireplace, grabbing a log from the stack beside it. The rough bark scraped my palms as I tossed it into the flames, watching sparks flare up like tiny rebellions. I needed something to do, something to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't storm upstairs and drag Sophie out myself. The fire snapped, a sound that cut through the quiet, and I felt his eyes on me. "Why her?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "Why me? What's this really about?" He didn't answer right away. I heard the clink of his glass, whiskey again, against the table, then the creak of his chair as he leaned forward. "You want the truth?" His tone was low, almost reluctant, like he was prying open a door he'd long kept shut. I faced him, the fire's heat warming my back. "I deserve it." He stood, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just out of reach. Up, close. His blue eyes weren't as cold as I'd thought. There was a shadow in them, a weight I hadn't noticed before. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We were engaged. I was 25, ambitious, climbing the ladder at Warrington Corp. She wanted a family. I wanted power." I froze, the log I'd been about to add slipping in my grip. He kept going, his gaze fixed on the fire. Not me. I broke it off, told her I didn't have time for love, for kids. She begged me to stay, said she'd wait. I didn't look back. 2 years later, she died. Pneumonia, alone in a rundown apartment. I could have saved her. I had the money, the means, but I didn't. The words landed like stones, heavy and unyielding. I set the log down, my hands trembling. What does that have to do with me? He met my eyes then, and the shadow deepened. "You remind me of her. Not your face, your fight. The way you'd do anything for Sophie. Sarah was like that too. I saw it in you that first day when you signed the contract without blinking. I married you because I couldn't save her. But I could save you." I stepped back, the heat of the fire suddenly too much. "You don't get to play savior with my life. I'm not some ghost you can resurrect." "I'm not trying to," he said, his voice cracking just enough to make me pause. "I'm trying to live with myself. You think I wanted this? A wife I bought? A sister-in-law who hates me? I did it because I owed someone, her, a debt I can't repay." The room spun, his confession a knife twisting in my gut. I thought of my father, walking out when I was 10, chasing money over us. Jim was the same, a man who'd traded love for ambition, only to drown in regret. But where Dad never came back, Jim was here. staring at me like I was his last chance. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why hide it?" He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the glass. "Because you'd hate me more, and I deserve it. I'm not a good man, Lily. I never was. I wanted to hate him. I did hate him for the control, the arrogance, the way he'd turned my life into his redemption story. But the crack in his voice, the way his hands clenched at his sides, made it harder. I saw Sophie in my mind, her defiance masking her fear, and I wondered if Jim's coldness hid something broken too. I turned back to the fire, grabbing another log and shoving it in, harder than I meant to. Sparks flew, and I felt the heat lick my skin. "You don't get to decide what I am to you," I said, my words sharp. "I'm here for Sophie, not your guilt." "I know," he said, softer now. "That's why I picked you." I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The fire roared back to life, its light dancing across the room, but it didn't touch the cold inside me. I reached into my pocket, pulling out Sophie's necklace, and ran my thumb over its smooth surface. She was upstairs, safe for now, because of this man I despised, but safe wasn't enough. I wanted her free, whole, the way she'd been before the debts and the darkness. I left him standing there, his shadow stretching across the floor as I headed for the stairs. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one a promise to keep fighting. For her, for me. But as I reached the door, I hesitated, his words ringing in my ears. I could have saved her. They stuck, a splinter I couldn't pull out. The rain kept falling, a steady drum against the glass. I glanced back once, catching his profile against the firelight. Alone, still, a man haunted by ashes. Then I walked away, the necklace warm, in my hand, a tether to the only family I had left. Rain hammered the car's windshield, a relentless roar that drowned out the world beyond the glass. The headlights sliced through the dark, casting jagged beams across the wet pavement as Jim gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. I sat in the passenger seat, 34 and fraying at the edges, my fingers clenched around Sophie's silver necklace. The city blurred past us, neon signs, honking horns, a chaos I couldn't escape. In the back seat, Sophie slumped against the window, her breathing shallow, her defiance muted by exhaustion. We'd been driving for an hour, ever since Edward's latest move hit the headlines. The tabloids screamed it in bold: Warrington heir weds gold digger to bury scandal. Photos of me, grainy, unflattering shots from the press event, splashed across every newsstand, paired with lies about my scheming to trap Jim. Edward had orchestrated it, a calculated strike to oust Jim from Warrington Corp. The board was meeting tomorrow, and they wanted him gone. Jim's voice cut through the rain's drumbeat, low and tight. "You should have left when I told you to. This is on you now." I turned to him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You think I'd run? Leave Sophie to those vultures? This is your mess, not mine." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look at me. "It's my mess, and I'm cleaning it up. You're free to go. Take her and disappear." The words hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch. "I'm not a coward, and neither are you, so stop acting like one." The car swerved slightly, tires hissing against the wet road. He shot me a glance, those blue eyes flashing with something. Anger, maybe, or something deeper. "You don't know what you're in for. Edward won't stop. He'll drag you both through the mud until there's nothing left." "Then let him try," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "I've got nothing to lose but her." Sophie stirred in the back, her voice a rasp. "Lily, don't, just let me go, I'll figure it out." I twisted around, meeting her bleary eyes. "No, you won't. You're in this car because I won't let you drown. Not again. She opened her mouth to argue, but my phone buzzed in my lap, cutting her off. I glanced at the screen. Sophie's number, which made no sense. She was right here. I answered, my heart sinking as a familiar voice crackled through, slurred and desperate. Lily, it's me. Don't hang up. It was Sophie, but not the Sophie beside me. This was a recording, a voicemail I hadn't seen until now. I met her, okay? Sarah. Jim's Sarah, years ago, at the casino. She was broke, sick, asking about him. I didn't tell you 'cause I knew you'd hate him more. But he didn't know. She died alone, Lily. I'm sorry. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, the rain's roar fading to a dull hum. Sophie, the real Sophie, shifted beside me, her eyes wide. What was that? I couldn't speak. My mind raced back to Jim's confession by the fireplace. Sarah, the woman he'd abandoned, the ghost he'd married me to atone for. But Sophie had known her, met her, kept it from me. The betrayal sliced through me, sharp and cold, but it wasn't just her. It was him. He'd built this lie around us, and I'd walked right into it. Pull over, I said, my voice trembling but firm. Jim didn't argue. He eased the car onto the shoulder, the engine idling as rain pelted the roof. I turned to Sophie, my grip on the necklace tightening. You knew her. You knew who I was to him. And you didn't tell me. Her face crumpled, tears mixing with the shadows. I didn't want you to give up. You were saving me, Lily. I couldn't stop. I cut her off, my voice breaking. You let me sell myself to a man chasing a dead woman, and you didn't. Say a word. Jim's hand twitched on the wheel, his voice low. What's she talking about? I spun to him, fury boiling over. She met Sarah. Your Sarah. At the casino, before she died. Sophie knew your guilt trip was why you picked me, and she kept it quiet so I'd stay in your trap. His face went still, the color draining from it. I didn't know, he said, barely audible over the rain. I swear, Lily, I didn't. Save it, I snapped, my chest heaving. You don't get to play innocent now. The car fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Sophie sobbed softly, her hands covering her face, but I couldn't look at her. Not yet. I stared out the windshield, the rain blurring everything into a gray haze. I'd thought I was here for her, for family, but I'd been a pawn in a game I didn't even understand. His redemption, her survival, Edward's revenge. Headlights flared behind us, too close, too fast. A black SUV screeched to a stop, and Edward stepped out, his grin visible even through the downpour. He tapped the window with a gloved hand, his voice muffled but smug. Trouble in paradise, Jim? The board's waiting. I didn't think. I shoved the door open, rain soaking me instantly, and faced him. You want to tear him down? Fine. But I'm not your punching bag. I don't need his money, and I don't need your lies. I'm here for her, not him. Edward's grin widened, unfazed. Bold words, sweetheart. Let's see how long they last. Jim was out of the car now, standing beside me, his coat drenched. Back off, Edward, he growled. This ends now. I didn't wait for the rest. I climbed back in, slamming the door, and gripped the armrest as Jim slid into the driver's seat. Edward's laugh faded as we pulled away, the rain swallowing. Him whole. Sophie reached for my hand, but I pulled back, my eyes fixed on the road. I wasn't just fighting for her anymore. I was fighting for me. The boardroom of Warrington Corp gleamed under the harsh white glow of a crystal chandelier, its light bouncing off polished mahogany and glass. I stood at the back, 34 and soaked to the bone, my hair dripping rainwater onto the pristine floor. The silver necklace hung cold against my chest, a silent reminder of Sophie, who sat beside me, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Across the room, James Warrington, Jim, faced the firing squad of suits, his broad frame steady despite the storm we'd just driven through. Edward paced the head of the table, his dark eyes glinting with triumph. The board members, gray-haired men in tailored vests, watched him like hawks, their murmurs a low buzz beneath his voice. "James has lost control," he declared, tossing a stack of tabloids onto the table. The headlines screamed, "Gold Digger. Bride and Warrington Scandal Unveiled." "He's a liability. This marriage, a desperate grab to bury his past. We need leadership, not a soap opera." I clenched my fists, the necklace biting into my palm. Last night's revelation, Sophie's secret about Sarah, Jim's lost love, still burned in me, a wound too fresh to ignore. But Edward's smug grin fueled a different fire. He wasn't just after Jim. He wanted us all broken. Jim stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "The company's numbers are solid. My personal life doesn't change that. You want to talk leadership?" "Look at the profits," a board member coughed, adjusting his tie. "The press doesn't care about profits, James. They care about this circus. Your brother's right. We can't afford the distraction." Edward smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Exactly. Time's up, Jim. Step down or we vote you out." The room went still, the chandelier's light casting sharp shadows across Jim's face. I waited for him to fight, to throw Edward's betrayal back at him. Instead, he straightened, his gaze sweeping the table before landing on me. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "I resign, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the room. Edward's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. I felt the air leave my lungs, my mind reeling. Resign? After everything, the deal, the marriage, the lies. He was walking away? Why? I blurted, stepping forward, my wet shoes squeaking against the floor. "You're giving up?" He turned to me, his blue eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "I'm not giving up. I'm letting go. The company's not worth you or her." He nodded toward Sophie, who stared at him, wide-eyed. Edward laughed, a harsh bark that grated against my nerves. "Noble, Jim. Real noble. But it's too late. The damage is done." "No," I said, my voice cutting through his. I moved to Jim's side, facing Edward head-on. "You think you've won?" "He's stepping down to protect us, something you'd never understand. You don't care about family. He does." Edward's grin twisted into a sneer. "Protect you?" "He bought you, sweetheart. Don't kid yourself." I didn't flinch. "He paid Sophie's debts. Before the marriage, before any of this. He didn't tell me because he didn't want me to feel owned. That's more than you've ever done for anyone." The room went quiet again, the board members exchanging glances. Jim's head snapped toward me, his expression unreadable. "How did you—" "Sophie told me," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Last night, in the car. She said you cleared her slate weeks ago, no strings attached. You didn't need me to sign that contract. You did it anyway." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Edward's sneer faded, his hands gripping the table. "Lies!" he spat. "He's manipulating you." "Shut up!" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "You're the liar here. You've got nothing but headlines and spite. He's got a conscience." Jim's hand brushed mine, a fleeting touch that stopped me cold. "Lily," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," I said, meeting his gaze. "You don't get to carry this alone." He held my eyes for a moment, something raw flickering in his. Then he turned back to the board. "I'm out. You've got my resignation. But I'm not leaving her, or Sophie, to your mess, Edward. Try to touch them, and I'll burn this place down myself. The threat hung heavy, a promise wrapped in quiet fury. Edward opened his mouth, but a board member raised a hand. Enough, the man said, his voice weary. James, your resignation's accepted. Edward, sit down. We'll handle the press. The meeting dissolved into murmurs, but I barely heard them. I grabbed Sophie's arm, pulling her toward the door, my soaked clothes clinging to me like a second skin. Jim followed, his steps steady behind us. We stepped into the hall, the chandelier's light fading as the glass doors swung shut. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gleaming under streetlights. I turned to Jim, my chest tight. Why didn't you tell me you'd already paid? He looked away, his breath visible in the cold air. Because I needed you to stay. Not for the money, for me. To remember I could still do something right. The confession hit me harder than Edward's taunts. I wanted to hate him, to cling to the anger that had kept me upright. But the truth was there, raw and unguarded, and it cracked something in me. Sophie stepped closer, her voice small. Lily, I'm sorry. About Sarah, about everything. I didn't want you to... I cut her off, pulling her into a hug. Her sweater, clean now, one I'd given her, pressed against my wet jacket, and I felt her tremble. You're here, I said, my voice breaking. That's enough. She nodded against my shoulder, tears soaking through. I let her go, turning to Jim. You didn't have to do this, I said. Lose everything. He met my eyes, steady and sure. I didn't lose everything. I kept what matters. The streetlights flickered, casting his face in gold and shadow. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. I took Sophie's hand and started walking, Jim falling in step beside us. The city hummed around us, alive and indifferent. But for the first time, I felt the weight lift. Just a little. The Warrington estate felt different now, its vast living room softened by the crackle of the fireplace I'd just lit. The scent of burning wood mingled with the faint bitterness of coffee. Sophie's favorite, brewing in a pot I'd set on the counter. I stood by the hearth, 34 and weary, my fingers brushing the silver necklace around my neck. It was a quiet night, a week after Jim's resignation, and the world outside had settled into an uneasy hush. No more headlines, no more Edward's taunts. Just us, piecing ourselves back together. Sophie sat on the couch, her knees pulled up, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She was sober tonight, her eyes clearer than I'd seen in months, though the shadows of her past still lingered. Jim leaned against the wall near the windows, his hands in his pockets, watching us with a stillness I'd come to recognize. Not cold anymore, but guarded, like a man waiting for permission to step closer. I crossed to the kitchen, pouring the coffee into 3 mugs. The steam curled upward, warm against my hands as I carried them back. I handed one to Sophie, her fingers brushing mine as she took it. Thanks, she said, her voice small but steady. Smells like home. It does, I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. I remembered the mornings she'd stumble into our old apartment, hungover but grinning, begging for a cup just like this. I'd make it for her, every time, because that's what sisters do. I offered the second mug to Jim. He hesitated, then took it, his fingers grazing mine for a heartbeat. You didn't have to, he said, his tone low, almost uncertain. I wanted to, I replied, meeting his blue eyes. They weren't icy now, just tired, searching. I sat beside Sophie, cradling my own mug, the warmth seeping into my palms. We're all here. Might as well act like it. Sophie sipped her coffee, then set it down, her hands fidgeting with the blanket. I'm trying, Lily. The meetings. They're helping. I haven't gambled in a week. I reached over, squeezing her knee. I know. I see it. You're doing good, Soph. She nodded, but her eyes flicked to Jim. You didn't have to take me in. After everything, Sarah, the debts. Why'd you do it? He straightened, setting his mug on the mantel. The firelight danced across his face, softening the hard lines I'd once hated. Because I could, he said simply. I walked away from Sarah when she needed me. I didn't want to walk away from you. The words hung there, heavy with a truth I hadn't fully grasped until now. I thought of his confession by the fire, Sarah, the love he'd abandoned, the guilt he'd carried. I'd seen it as a selfish act, marrying me to ease his conscience. But this, taking Sophie in, paying her debts before he even knew me, was something else, something selfless. Tell me about her, I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. Sarah, what was she like? He looked at me, surprised, then glanced at the fire. She was bright, stubborn, always laughing, even when things got tough. She'd fight for anyone she loved, no matter the cost. He paused, his jaw tightening. Like you. The comparison hit me like a wave, stirring something deep and unsteady. I didn't know if I liked it, if I wanted to be his echo of her. But I saw Sophie in my mind, her reckless courage, and I understood. Sarah wasn't just his ghost. She was a mirror, reflecting the people he couldn't save. Until now. Sophie shifted, her voice breaking the silence. I met her once. You? No. At the casino. She asked about you, said she'd heard you were big now. I didn't know who she was, not really. Just some sad woman with a cough. I wish I'd told you. Jim's eyes softened, a rare crack in his armor. You couldn't have known. I didn't leave her anything to find me with. I set my mug down, standing to add another log to the fire. The bark scraped my hands as I tossed it in, sparks flaring, up like memories I couldn't shake. Dad leaving, Sophie falling, me picking up the pieces. I walked away once too, I said, my back to them. From Dad. He wanted money, not us. I told him to go, and he did. I've been running from that ever since. Sophie's breath hitched. Lily, you didn't... I did, I cut in, turning to face her. And I'd do it again. But I'm not running from you. Or this. I glanced at Jim, the words spilling out before I could stop them. We're all here because we've lost something. Maybe we can find it together. The room went quiet, the fire's crackle filling the space. Sophie wiped her eyes, a shaky smile breaking through. Jim stepped closer, his hand resting on the mantel, close enough that I could feel his warmth. You don't have to forgive me, he said, his voice rough. I don't expect it. I don't, I admitted, my gaze steady. Not yet. But I see you trying. That's something. He nodded, a faint curve to his lips, the first real smile I'd seen from him. You're the fire I thought I'd lost, Lily. You and her. My chest tightened, but I didn't look away. I reached for Sophie's hand, her fingers curling, around mine, and felt the weight of the past shift. Just a little. Edward's voice rang in my head, a taunt from the car last night. You'll regret this. I'd hung up on him, my thumb pressing the screen hard enough to hurt. He didn't matter now. This did. I moved to the fire, resting my hand on Jim's shoulder as he knelt to stoke it. The heat flowed through me, a quiet strength I hadn't known I needed. We're not done, I said, my voice firm, but we're starting. Sophie laughed, soft and real, the sound blending with the fire's song. For the first time, the ashes felt like a foundation, not a grave. The park near the Warrington estate glowed under a pale afternoon sun, its oak trees casting long shadows across the grass. I stood by a wooden bench, 34 and lighter than I'd felt in years, the silver necklace cool against my skin. Sophie's letter rested in my hands, its edges worn from the morning I'd spent reading it over and over. She'd left it on the kitchen counter before heading to her first job in months, a barista gig she'd fought for after finishing rehab. Lily, Jim, thank you. I'm clean because of you. Don't give up on each other. Her words were messy, heartfelt, a promise etched in ink. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket, my gaze drifting to the horizon. The past month had been quiet, too quiet, after the storm of Edward's betrayal and Jim's resignation. The tabloids had moved on, chasing fresher scandals, and Warrington Corp was Edward's now. But here, in this small patch of green, I felt the weight of it all lift, just enough to breathe. Footsteps crunched behind me, steady and familiar. Jim stopped beside me, his coat unbuttoned, his hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything. At first, just stood there, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the crisp air. I glanced at him, catching the lines around his eyes. Deeper now, but softer, like a man who'd finally stopped running. She's doing good, I said, breaking the silence. Sophie. First paycheck today. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I saw. She texted me a picture of her apron. Said it's the ugliest thing she's ever worn. I laughed, the sound surprising me. She's right. It's hideous. The quiet settled again, comfortable this time. I thought of the nights we'd spent in the estate. Me brewing coffee, Sophie laughing over old stories, Jim stoking the fire with a care I hadn't expected. We'd built something, not out of the contract or the debts, but out of the ashes we'd all carried. I pulled the necklace from under my sweater, running my thumb over its smooth surface. She gave me this when she was 16, said it'd keep me safe. I didn't think I'd need it until now. Jim watched me, his blue eyes steady. It suits you. Always has. I met his gaze, my chest tightening. Why'd you stay, Jim? After the board? After everything? You could have walked away. Started over. He looked out at the trees, his breath visible in the cool air. I did walk away once. From Sarah. From myself. I lost her, and I lost who I was. I stayed because you and Sophie. You gave me a chance to find it again. The word sank in, heavy and true. I thought of Sarah, her laughter, her fight, the woman he'd loved and let go. I'd hated being her shadow, but now, standing here, I saw it differently. She wasn't a ghost I had to fight. She was a bridge, a reason we'd all ended up here. I stepped closer, the grass soft under my boots. I didn't want this, you. No, the marriage, the deal. I thought you were just another man who'd take and take until there was nothing left. I was, he said, his voice rough. For a long time I was, but you changed that. I shook my head, a small smile, breaking through. No, you did. You paid her debts before you even knew me. You resigned to keep us out of the mess. That wasn't me. That was you. He looked down, his hands clenching in his pockets. I didn't do it for praise, Lily. I did it because I couldn't lose you, too. The confession hung between us, raw and unguarded. I reached out, my hand finding his arm, the fabric of his coat warm under my fingers. You didn't, I said, my voice steady. I'm still here. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw no walls, just a man who'd fought his way back from the dark. He pulled a small box from his pocket, his fingers trembling as he opened it. A simple silver ring glinted inside, no diamonds, no flash, Just quiet, honest metal. I don't have the company anymore, he said, his voice low. I don't have the power or the headlines, but I have this. And I want you. Not because of a contract, but because I love you. Marry me again, Lily. For real. My breath caught. The world narrowing to the ring. His face. The steady beat of my heart. I thought of the chapel. The cold vows. The deal that had bound us. Then I thought of the firelit nights. The coffee mugs. The way he'd stood by Sophie. When I couldn't. This wasn't the man I'd married. This was the man I'd found. Yes, I said, the word slipping out like a sigh. Yes, I will. He slid the ring onto my finger, his touch gentle, reverent. It fit perfectly, a quiet promise against my skin. I stepped into his arms, his coat rough against my cheek, and felt the warmth of him seep into me. The park faded, the trees, and the sun blurring into the background as we held each other, two people who'd burned down their pasts to build something new. That night, back at the estate, I lit the fireplace myself, the logs catching with a soft roar. Sophie burst through the door, her apron still on, her grin wide as she waved her paycheck. I made it through my shift, she shouted, then stopped, eyeing the ring. Wait, what's this? I laughed, holding up my hand. He asked. I said yes, she whooped, throwing her arms around me, then Jim, her energy lighting up the room. I set the necklace on the mantel, its silver catching the firelight, a symbol of the family we'd fought for, the one we'd keep. We stood there, the three of us, the flames dancing before us. The ashes of our old lives had settled, but the fire burned bright, a testament to the love, the forgiveness, the home we'd made from the ruins.